Hello and welcome to ICA in Conversation, broadcasting on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month and focusing on current issues and challenges in compliance and counter financial crime. I'm Tim Tyler, and coming up, we're going to consider what is the highest volume crime across much of the world: fraud, its nature, and the evolution of the threat, and in particular, how authorities and businesses are responding to it. To do this, I'm delighted to be joined by Sir David Green. Sir David served as director of the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom from 2012 to 2018, overseeing some of the most significant corporate fraud and bribery prosecutions in recent UK history. As ever, we'd love to hear from you wherever you join us from across the world. For those that are joining live, and of course, I recognize that some will be listening to this at a future time through the various platforms that we publish this through, or through the ICA's own learning hub. We'd love to hear from you in the meantime, and any questions or observations that you may have that can be raised through the chat function using the Zoom facility. But right now, Sir David, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
I wonder, can we start by considering, well, the nature of the fraud threat, and in particular, how it's changing, how it's evolving?
Yeah, to me, I think fraud, thinking about it, has three key characteristics. It is opportunistic, it is adaptive, and it is shape-shifting. And like its ugly sibling, corruption, and the other ugly sibling, bribery, its seed will adapt to whatever soil it lands on. A classic example would be romance fraud. Now, that would have been impossible before the internet. But the internet has just enabled the kind of instant communication and seeing people on television that kind of fraud requires. But that's just a small example. It's fraud exploits any situation, anywhere, where value can be extracted by dishonesty or by deception. And I think it's crucial to recognize that being the case, we can never hope to investigate and prosecute our way out of fraud. And the answer surely has to be educating the public, increasing awareness of fraud, particularly in relation to vulnerabilities, and to beef up counter-fraud enforcement. And I think the key to that has to be joining together as it were, multi-stakeholders in single initiatives and efforts against fraud.
Okay, well, there's a lot that you've touched on there. Can we start to unpack that? And I think it might be useful to go back to the example that you gave of romance fraud and the way.
I'm not an expert on romance fraud, Tim. I should tell you. Yeah.
Well, look, we had Becky Holmes. You won't know Becky, but Becky joined me for a conversation a month ago. She's written a book called Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You. And this comes out of her experience talking to and supporting so many victims of romance fraud. But I think it does really nicely illustrate your point that here is a type of fraud that didn't exist 30 years, 40 years ago. The nature of fraud is, as you say, opportunistic. And I mean, I think of that mythical creature: you cut one head off and another head or another two or three heads grow in its place. And I think that's the threat that we face. In a moment, I'd like to come on to explore with you why it's the case that we can't simply prosecute a way out of this, and what that looks like in terms of collaborative approach to challenge it. But before we do that, can we spend just a little bit longer thinking about the nature of fraud? And let's go back to the romance fraud example. And I'm in danger of working this too hard, but I think if we look to the future, we can see that artificial intelligence is now enabling this particular type of fraud. And human trafficking now links to it, where we're seeing victims of human trafficking being corralled in centers in places like Myanmar and elsewhere in the world, where they are forced to commit this fraud. They have no choice. So the offenders in this instance are themselves a victim. And I think that's a feature that we often see in fraud, that it converges, it overlaps with many other types of crime.
That's what I meant by shape-shifting. It's very, very hard to pin down. And you made a very good point just now, Tim, that I said that it would have been romance fraud would have been impossible before the internet, but of course AI has added a whole new dimension to that, and then opportunistically it marries up with another potential in the form of human trafficking and so forth, which opens up more possibilities. So it is, as you said, it is a hydra and almost impossible.
Yeah. That's it. I was looking for that word. Thank you so much. We're talking, of course, here about a type of fraud that is not only is it taking a lot of money from its victims, but perhaps even worse, it's breaking the hearts of so many people across the world. But it is nonetheless a volume crime. And your experience, and I'd love to just briefly dwell on that, as the director of the Serious Fraud Office, you were more concerned, I think, for a little while on high value international corruption and fraud, and that we have to be careful not to sort of polarize the position and say, well, there's high value and there's high volume, there's nothing in between. But it's a different landscape, isn't it, that you were working in that context? Or would you agree with that?
Very, very different. I mean, the SFO did not do romance fraud, and it did not do volume fraud. It was, as you may know, the purpose of the SFO was always to deal with absolute top-end fraud. Serious and complex fraud, we used to call it, and still do. That's what it was designed for back in 1987. It was established under something called the Roskill model, strangely designed by Lord Roskill, who for the first time suggested that under a single roof we should have both investigators and prosecutors with a view to attacking the problem of serious and complex fraud. Now, this means that you are taking on very, very serious, wealthy institutions and individuals. And from that, obviously, we've seen over the years, the SFO rarely gets a good press, but we've seen over the years the various problems that faced it emerging and still facing it. One is the sheer complexity of cases. You touched upon international bribery. That is, it's a classic example, immensely complicated. I go back to my time, say, the LIBOR cases or the Rolls-Royce case or Barclays. That was immensely complicated. And it was made more difficult by the sheer volume of documentation that had to be examined. And touching upon something we mentioned earlier, AI, way back in time when we were doing, I remember the Rolls-Royce case. Rolls-Royce were basically hoping for a deferred prosecution agreement, which in the end they got. And they gave us access to 30 million documents, 30 million, mainly computer files. And this would have taken on the traditional method where we used to hire in junior barristers to just go through endless documents on screen. we got Rolls-Royce to agree that we could use AI to search the documents. And had it been done by human hand, I think it probably would have taken 2 years just to go through the documents. I think, as it happened, we did it in, I think, 3 months. But AI clearly is the way forward on dealing with mass documentation cases. And that may well require a change in the law at statute level,
yes,
and a recognition that the present state of the law on disclosure and the prosecution obligations on disclosure make very, very large, document-heavy complex cases almost unprosecutable. And that is a fact which I think is slowly emerging and becoming acknowledged. I think the third problem, after complexity and disclosure, is probably resources, although I think most directors will always deny this. By resources, I don't necessarily mean the overall budget. I noticed that I think 25-26, the SFO budget was over £95 million, which is not bad at all. It was, I think, 58 million when I left in 2018, so it's moving in the right direction. The problem is, and I should say, further expenditure on the SFO is justified simply by this. For instance, the SFO since 2014 has brought in £1.7 billion to the Treasury from deferred prosecution agreements. And here we are, the 7th largest economy in the world. And I think in 2024, we spent 0.042% of GDP on law enforcement around economic crime. Now that needs rethinking, without doubt. I'm quite sure of it. So resources, that is a problem. And it can lead, in a practical sense, to the SFO being outgunned. A huge international company will go to, as it were, city law. They will throw limitless money at it, and city law will throw 100 lawyers at a particular problem, while the SFO is, can probably put together. In my time, the largest investigative team was just over 90 people, but you can see that the potential for being outgunned is without doubt there. I think there are solutions to most of those problems, including a general problem about pace of investigation, on which the SFO is frequently criticised. And that's this. I think I'd probably start with Theresa May. When she was Home Secretary, she didn't know she was going to be PM, I'm sure, and her legacy, I'm pretty sure she thought her legacy would be the National Crime Agency. And the bit, to my mind, to outside observers, of the NCA that perhaps wasn't working as well as other bits was the Economic Crime Command. And I think Theresa May's idea as Prime Minister was to roll the Serious Fraud Office and all its resources, both investigative and prosecutorial, into the NCA to solve that problem. Now, I have always thought, and did think at the time, that the answer was to do exactly the reverse, to actually move that, as it were, police, investigative, highly professional, highly experienced resource out of the NCA into the Serious Fraud Office. And along those same lines, and I took great encouragement from it, we've had the appointment of Nick Fgrave, a former Deputy Commissioner of the Met, as Director of the Serious Fraud Office. I'm very sorry to see him go after just half his time there for personal reasons. But then the temporary director, I gather, is Graham McNulty, who comes from a very similar background. So I think my point is, rather laboured, but my point is that I think the experience of senior highly intelligent police officers at the top of the at or near the top of the SFO can actually get a grip on the pace of investigation and deal with highly complex investigations, possibly better, quite possibly better than people like me. My background was I was a knockabout defence prosecuting barrister for 25 years, and then I did a government job at Revenue and Customs, and then went to the Serious Fraud Office. So as I say, my point is that I think probably professional investigative background could contribute a great deal at the top of the SFO.
So if I can capture some of the threads around what we're sharing here, we're thinking in particular about large scale, high value, international, complex fraud and corruption. Very often there are political elements to this. We've seen that with Rolls-Royce, with the Saudi in the past, the Saudi authorities and involvement, and so on. So you've, I think, described a number of challenges in the investigation and prosecution of fraud at that level. Disclosure is one. And for those that aren't in the UK or not involved in criminal justice, that requirement for disclosure essentially places a burden on the prosecution of sharing all the relevant information. Now, that might sound easy, but actually it means that judgments have to be made around what is or could be relevant. You can't just simply provide everything and expect the defense to work it out. I may have rather clumsily described that, but it is a big burden. And it comes, I think, from the Guildford Four, the time of the Guildford Four, when it was realized after 4 people who were put in prison for terrorism were actually innocent. And it took some years for this to be found. And the prosecution at the time arguably had information in their possession that would have demonstrated that they were innocent. So this gives rise to this huge disclosure requirement. And arguably, yes, the law needs to change. It was written at a time when high volume computer records, artificial intelligence was just a twinkle in the eye. So that's one challenge. The pace of the investigation is another huge challenge. And I worked with 5 SFO inquiries, and they were very, very slow, candidly. And sometimes for very good reason. But what we're seeing now from Nick Fgrave and others is that they're looking more focus on the fraudster and not just the crime, although that's not always possible. And there is now a more proactive front foot approach to the challenge. And there are other challenges, for instance, the sort of asymmetrical relationship with the defense, where they're able to employ large amounts of very expensive and sometimes very aggressive legal teams.
I think there's probably, Tim, if I might interrupt,
please,
me. Yeah. I think there's one other facet which is quite hard to describe, but which I think is highly relevant. If you're going after, as at the Serious Fraud Office, perhaps Barclays Bank, or, huge international company, or Rolls-Royce, company that employs 47,000 people worldwide. On the one hand, of course, everybody wants you to enforce the law, but many's the time I heard people say, well, why are you going after Rolls-Royce? They're really important to our economy. And so there's that kind of slight difficulty, slight ambiguity in the attitude, certainly of the public, towards things like that, and possibly of some in government. But that's always that. I mean, certainly, say if speaking to diplomats abroad, clearly they found the role of the SFO a bit strange, because their job is to pump British exports and British companies all over the world. And I've seen the looks on many an ambassador's face when I explained what the SFO did. They didn't say anything, obviously, but you could see the look.
Yes. At one level, you could argue it's kind of acting against the national interest, at least the short-term national interest. I think there's a strong argument to say the long-term, it is in our interest to demonstrate that we are a country, a jurisdiction of integrity. But we've been thinking then about the high value international crime, and we could talk for much longer about this, but let's come back to where we started, where we were thinking about the high volume types of fraud that can be just as damaging at a personal level. And I think you shared that we've reached a point now where we can't simply use criminal justice outcomes. We can't prosecute our way out of this. Now, that's true in the UK, and I'm sure will be true across much of the world.
Certainly.
That we've reached a tipping point where fraud is so large, it's so ubiquitous, it's part of our culture to some extent, that we need to find alternative ways to respond to it. Could you perhaps unpack that a little? What have you got in mind when you say that?
Well, I think probably a good example is the organisation of which I chair the trustees. That's the Fraud Advisory Panel, which seeks to bring together a collaborative approach. And this is really the key, a kind of multi-stakeholder approach. It seeks to bring together anti-fraud, counter-fraud professionals. They might be lawyers, law enforcement, accountants, businesses, and so forth, to bring them together really to share and assemble best practice, to develop best advice to both the public, to companies, and indeed to government, and indeed to take initiatives within the fraud space. The Fraud Advisory Panel really has three pillars I can describe to you in terms of what it actually does. The first is the Business Fraud Alliance, which is, and it shows how times have changed, supported by Barclays Bank and others. It is basically, it has commissioned, it's an FAP initiative, which has commissioned research in relation to strengthening fraud and fraud defences that can be used and put in place by businesses, particularly small businesses. The second is charity fraud awareness, where the FAP run a week event every year. It's a 5-day event every year. The Charity Fraud Awareness Week, which basically brings together charities and discusses vulnerabilities and disseminates best practice. And the third, and this to me is one of the most, perhaps the most interesting initiative, is the future counter-fraud community, where we are bringing together, or trying to bring together, professionals, educational institutions, and directing our efforts towards aspiring counter-fraud careers, those who would aspire towards a counter-fraud career, by encouraging mentoring and putting that in place, enhancing education, and encouraging through regular contact those who would wish to go in that direction. So it looks towards the future and what might be achieved that way. Yeah. We also, of course, publish counter-fraud resources which are available online. So I suppose that's an example of the way, what you mentioned earlier, that I think the only way, bearing in mind we can't investigate and prosecute our way out of it, the way forward has to be this kind of multi-stakeholder cooperative approach.
And although that might seem kind of obvious now, I look back to my role in the City of London Police Fraud Squad 40 years ago, and there was no concept of that. Or yeah, if there was, it was kind of a side issue that wasn't really taken very seriously, this idea about fraud prevention. We've traveled a long way in a short period of time. And just to be clear, we're talking about partnership between government, civil society, including the Fraud Advisory Panel, and equivalents all around the world. This isn't just in the UK. This is taking place. We're seeing similar initiatives across much of the world. Yeah. And law enforcement, whether that's National Crime Agency, local police force, or Serious Fraud Office. Now, whether you would categorize Serious Fraud Office as law enforcement, I'm not sure. I mean, it sits within the Attorney General's.
Yes, we tried to duck that.
Okay. Okay. And with the banks and financial services and businesses. And we've moved so far now that the banks now are picking up the costs. few years ago. So, and a good reason for instance, banks to apply their minds to this, because it's causing losses not just to their customers, but to them as well.
Yes, indeed. I think, yeah, following on the points you just made, I heard it said recently that the City of London police have deliberately pivoted in the last couple of years in relation to fraud from investigation towards prevention. And the kind of education that requires. And secondly, you said a change in attitude by the banks. Well, I gave the example of the support that Barclays has given to our Business Fraud Alliance. And as you say, it's a very interesting pivot on the part of the banks that they move towards prevention and education now.
Can I look at this, though? We've only got a few minutes remaining, but I wonder if it's useful to look at this for a moment from the perspective of victims. So I guess we've looked at it briefly from a government perspective, where I think we can see that governments around the world have kind of outsourced, largely, not entirely, but largely outsourced this, bringing the private sector and civil society into the conversation and into the response. We've looked at it briefly from a bank's perspective, where we're seeing the investment by the banks and a concern to support and protect their customers. But what about the victims? I mean, it gets more difficult, isn't it? Because they're the conversations we're not necessarily having. They're the millions of people who are suffering daily, whether that's simply through financial loss or through that's romance fraud, their hearts being broken, or just that loss of confidence in the society and their place within it. Do you think the victims have a strong enough voice in this?
Probably not. I mean, I come from a generation of barristers where the victim was sort of in inverted commas and someone who waited outside court till they were called in to give evidence and then went off afterwards. Now, the treatment of witnesses of victims in all sorts of offences has changed radically since the early 1980s, and thank goodness for that. But are we focused enough on victims? I think of fraud. I think really, again, it comes back surely to education. Surely victims having lost money, they don't want someone to hold their hand and say, I'm so sorry. We've got to use their experience to make sure this does not happen, and also do everything possible to retrieve money from those who have defrauded others.
Yes, and of course that is a whole separate issue. And you mentioned, of course, that the Fraud Advisory Panel, one of the three pillars of their work, is about raising awareness and understanding. And that does involve reaching out to current, past and future victims in trying to manage that. But let's just touch on that asset recovery situation. You gave a really interesting number. I think you said 0.0042%.
0.042, yes.
0.042. So that, I think, highlights the fact that we're facing a massive scourge that impacts so many people, and yet the level of investment by governments in countering the threat isn't a proportionate response. I'm sure if you have someone from the Home Office or equivalents from around the world, they would argue on this point. But there is an interesting statistic that sits, I think, in parallel with this, and that is the asset recovery figure, which you just mentioned. I've looked at this. I think the United Nations figure for asset recovery levels is about 0.2%. That, I think, is incredibly generous. When I've looked at this, and at one point in my past, when I was with what's now the National Crime Agency, I had oversight for asset recovery levels at a sort of federal level within the UK. So I take some responsibility for this, and I calculated it was more like 0.01% that we were actually getting back in terms of recovery of assets from the criminal community in comparison to the size of the criminal economy. So there's a huge opportunity here to do so much more and to have an impact in this space.
But again, it requires a level of cooperation that we do not yet have. I mean, I can think of a number of frauds that I came across where within seconds, literally the touch of a button, the profits of a fraud were transferred to Russia or certain Gulf states and become almost practically impossible to get back.
Yes.
So we're talking about a level of cooperation that we simply don't have yet.
And you could argue that maybe there's good reason for that. We're talking about jurisdictional integrity and
Yeah,
the fact that we can't reach into the Gulf states or Moscow to grab money from the UK because that's a side of the jurisdiction. And
I think, Tim, what we have to resist is anybody suggesting that losses through fraud are frankly just the cost of doing business. We have to resist that attitude.
Thank you. Absolutely. And that is something that we encounter. And you quoted the very tiny proportion of law enforcement allocated to fraud. I think there's also something about that in business as well, that businesses will take this idea that, well, it's just a cost of doing business. We'll do what we can, but we're not going to commit serious resource to preventing it. But actually, even if you go with that argument for a moment, those costs can be very, very high. And I think the United Nations has published figures, or maybe the World Bank has published figures, that the cost of fraud can be as much as 10% in some parts of the world. So once again, we see this sort of asymmetric relationship. We've come to our 30 minutes, Sir David. We've covered a lot in this time. I'm going to invite you, if I may, just to finish with any closing thoughts that you may have. But whilst I give you a moment to think about that, can I just briefly wrap up? Over the last 30 minutes, we've talked about fraud, both in terms of a volume threat across the world. And in particular, we've thought about how responding to this requires collaboration across law enforcement, governments, civil society, banks, financial services, and other businesses, as well as potential victims. They are also got a part to play in this. We've also briefly, and I found that fascinating, had a slight insight to your world within the Serious Fraud Office, where you were dealing with high value, highly political and international fraud, which is different in nature, but not necessarily so much more serious in its impact. Any last thoughts there?
I don't think I could put it better than you have, Tim. Actually, we've got to talk. It comes down to education, awareness, cooperation, and bringing interested parties, including victims, together. That's been a wish list for a very long time, but it's something you've just got to keep plugging away at. I think all of us have.
Okay. Sir David, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, wherever you are in the world, for joining us for this conversation. And look into the future for those of us that are going to be reviewing this recording at some point, either through the ICA Learning Hub or through the various outlets that we publish it through. Thank you again for your interest. For the moment, though, do take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.